Take out your Bibles, open them up to the book of Daniel, chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, going to be right where we were last week. I'm actually backing up just a couple verses to get a running start at the main verse, because it's really only one verse. Daniel chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. Please stand with me in respect to God's word. I did let you sit, but now I'm going to make you stand. Daniel chapter 1, verse 5, going down through verse 8. And this is what it says. The king, that's Nebuchadnezzar, assigned them a daily portion of food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of the time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to be defiled. You may be seated. We're interrupting our series in Daniel for this Mother's Day message, but not really, because you can see we are still in Daniel. It all does tie together. It all ties in here. Last week we started this study in the series of Daniel, living godly in a godless age, and we saw that Daniel and his 3 friends were torn away from their homes and from their families, away from the people of God, and cast into a pagan culture to have their Jewishness scrubbed away and be reprogrammed to be more like the world. Sounds a lot like our day today, doesn't it, that we're living in? That's why we're doing this. Now, we looked backward last week, and we saw, as you must at a time like that, and we looked back and we asked the question, how did we get here? That's what you would do if you were these children torn away from your nation, hauled 500 miles away into this pagan culture, and asking yourself, how did things ever come to this? We saw how that question pertains to us today, too. Somehow, amidst all of this trouble in his life, Daniel and his 3 friends too, but if you notice that verse I read, it says Daniel resolved, so it puts it all on him. He must have been the leader or something like that out of this brave band of 4 boys there. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the king's food. It means he set himself. It's like in a football game, and you get up to the line of scrimmage, and both lines, they get down there and they set themselves because you're going to either charge in and try to get the other side, or you're bracing yourself for the other side to charge in and try and take your quarterback out and sack your quarterback. So either way, you are setting yourself so you will not be moved, anchoring yourself to the ground as best you can. That's exactly what that kind of word is. Daniel set himself. He resolved. There's a play in words there, because the same word is used in verse 7. Daniel did that on purpose, where it says that the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. It's not that, it's the same word. He set these new names on them to rob them of their identity. He pressed this on them. And it says, in response, Daniel set himself that he would not be moved. It's really replying just back to that very thing where they were trying to change them, and Daniel says, no, I am not going to be changed by this. I am not going to be defiled by this. As a 15-year-old boy, Daniel did that. Turn with me to the book of Habakkuk, chapter 3. That's right to the last 2 verses of the book of Habakkuk. I know I had you turn there last week, and that's part of it. I just want to make you turn to Habakkuk again. Just kidding. It actually does pertain. But how many times do you get to turn to the book of Habakkuk? Not very often. Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. Listen to what it says here. Habakkuk writes this after all the things. Last week he talked about the Chaldeans coming in and what they were going to be doing. And here he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's, and he makes me tread on high places. Now some of yours may say, he sets my feet like the deer. And that's what it's the same very word. So Daniel set himself that he would not be moved. And then we see Habakkuk comes in here writing about the same time, uses the same word and says, it is actually God who sets our feet so we cannot be moved. You ever seen the mountain goats and stuff like that in the mountains? They're so great. They're walking on these little nothing things. We were actually in Alaska a few years ago, and we were riding the train, and everybody's looking for mountain goat. And finally, this one guy starts screaming. He goes, sheep, sheep. It's like you'd never seen a sheep before. But you know, they're up on the mountains, and they're in these places. Habakkuk is referring to that, and he says, God sets our feet like that. We can be sure. Daniel set his feet that he would not be defiled. And then it says God set his feet even stronger so he would not be defiled. It is so impressive that this 15-year-old boy did this. When you see a young man faced with the obstacles Daniel was, coming up against a world trying to conform him to their system, and you see that he will stand and say, I will not be moved, you have to ask that question again. How did he get there? In the positive sense. We looked at it in the negative sense. How did the world get so bad that he was in that position? And now when you see that young man stand there, you've got to look back and say, how did he ever get there? Where did this young man get the wherewithal to stand up against the world the way he did? The most powerful man in the world has said, you will do this. And Daniel has said, no, I won't do this. Next week we'll look at how he did it, because he did use some tact there, and we want to learn that as we're living in this age. Considering the spiritual condition of the kingdom of Judah that they were torn out of, you really have to ask that question. What was the spiritual condition of the land of Judah when it was destroyed? We talked about it a little bit, but what was it like? You tell me. Your turn. Sinful. It was a mess. What were the things that were going on there? It was idolatry. You know, you go to the book of Ezekiel, and God lets Ezekiel go down and look in the lower chambers of the temple, and they had all the pagan sacrifices and worship going on in the very temple of God. The land of Judah that Daniel grew up in was a total mess. And you really then have to, especially at that time, ask, how did this young man get there and find this resolve to live for God when the very land he was living in was practically godless and the land he was taken to was totally godless? Where did he find this resolve to stand? Who taught those boys to live for the Lord no matter what happened? Well, oftentimes like this in the Bible and in life, it was the mother who did that. Sometimes the father, but many more times in Scripture we see it is the mother who preserves the faith of their children. In the Bible, a whole lot of times. Turn with me to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 23. Hebrews 11:23. This is the hall of faith where, the writer of Hebrews goes through the Old Testament. And he pulls out some examples for us to follow of people who had faith in God. And in 11:23, he begins talking about the beginning of the life of Moses. And look what he says here. He says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. You remember at that time, Pharaoh was afraid that the children of Israel were growing too much in his land. And so he said, you have to kill all the male children that were born. Here in Hebrews, it says that his parents saw that he was a good child, and they determined not to go along with the edict of Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world at that time. But turn back here with me to the book of Exodus. I want to show you something a little different here of that same account. Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. I want to show you something a little surprising after reading those verses in Hebrews. Just one verse in Hebrews, but we'll read 3 here in Exodus. It says, now a man from the house of Levi, or from the family of Levi, went and took as his wife a Levite woman. Now watch carefully as I read this. It says, the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. Who did it? She did. It's interesting, the book of Hebrews says they did this, but then when Moses wrote it himself in the book of Exodus, who does he give all the credit? Mom. Absolutely, Mom. I mean, Moses did write this himself. Maybe this was his Mother's Day to his mom for, saving his life, And we also see that as she was then taken to be his nursemaid, and we know that he learned about the things of Israel and his people. From whom do we think she probably learned all these things about the people of God? His mom. Even while he was living in Pharaoh's palace, his mother was managing to teach him the things about his people, so that one day he looked out and it says he saw his brothers and what they were under. He didn't think he was an Egyptian. He knew he was. He knew his identity. He knew his heritage, and he knew it all from Mom. And that is the way it often is. That's the way it often was in the Bible. I got to tell you, nobody loves you like your mother. Nobody loves you like... That's why you see all these big, tough sailors, right? And they got this tattoo, and it says 3 letters, Mom. You see people who are hurt, and who are they crying for? They're crying for Mom. Big, tough guys. It's kind of funny. I ask you, who loves you like your mom? It brought back a short memory. Several years ago, I was walking into work in the morning, and going in my cubicle, and as I do, I have to walk past my boss's cubicle, and because I'm follically challenged, he said, "Good morning, Kojak." Well, because I was born in the 60s, raised in the 70s, I'm a child of the 70s pretty much, I just blurted right back, "Who loves you, baby?" And all the millennials sat there and said, "What?" And all the Gen Z and all that. But then I had things like popping up on my desk like this afterward. All the time. And one time, even a Kojak doll. And I don't know where it went because it's probably worth money. But a Kojak doll on my desk. But I noticed these have shrunk. Have you noticed that? That owl always asked, how many licks does it take to get to the center? A lot less than it did in the 70s, I'll tell you that. All that's pretty much irrelevant except for the question, who loves you? Mom. That's usually the answer. Sadly, not everyone gets to know unconditional love in our world. But probably the one true chance of knowing unconditional love in this world we live in is from your mother. We live in a day and age when it seems many people would discard a baby for being less than perfect, or maybe has Downs, or maybe has a physical impairment, and now they can see those things, in the womb, even before the child is born. I think back to April 4th of 1991, when a doctor walked into a room with Lisa and I and looked at the ultrasounds of our son Brian and said, he can't make it. And if you weren't this far along in the pregnancy, I would recommend an abortion. We've been there. I'm so glad we didn't. We had 29 years with him, And when I get hard on abortion, I want you to hear my heart. I'm not talking about the girls and the women. It's the industry. It's the laws. It's all these things that makes me so angry. It's being pushed on these girls, and they don't know any better. We might wonder why God would allow anyone to have to face that kind of a choice, and so many people do face that kind of a choice with a child that's going to have life struggles all their life, and they know it, and should they place their whole life on hold? But I have seen mothers who have taken a child into their arms when everybody else would have said no, and they had the opportunity to give that child unconditional love. And that child could give them nothing but love. but they took it, and it was worth it every step of the way. God has put this special thing in the heart of the mother to love and nurture children, even when risking their own lives. We saw that in the story with Moses there. She risked her life to save Moses' life. In fact, God uses the love of a mother to exemplify his love for us. I won't have you turn here. I'll just read it to you. Isaiah 49, 15 and 16, if you want to take a note of that. But it says this, "Can a woman forget her nursing child?" That's God's picture of his love for his people. He says, can a woman forget about her child even while she's nursing? He says that she would have no compassion on the son of her womb. And he does show that his love is even greater, because even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. Behold, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. I love that. What did he use to engrave our names on the palm of his hands? Nails. That's way back in Isaiah. Isn't that beautiful? But he shows us when he's looking for the ultimate picture of love for us, where does he turn? To mom. Moses' mother risked her life to save his life, and then it's pretty clear that it was her who taught him all the things of God while she was his nursemaid in Pharaoh's palace. It was likely Hannah who helped Samuel grow up to be the spiritual leader of Israel, when you consider that he was put in the household of Eli, and Eli couldn't even get his own sons to grow up and be right. We have a brilliant example of all this in Proverbs 31. I think a lot of churches will probably be hearing from Proverbs 31. We think of the excellent woman in that chapter, correct? Proverbs 31. But nearly everyone I have ever heard misses this one incredible statement at the very start of the chapter. It's up on the screen, so you can go ahead and turn there, because I want you to see this. Proverbs 31, verses 1 and 2. It says this, the words of King Lemuel. Now, we believe that is Solomon talking. Most people would agree that that is Solomon, just under a name. I don't know why he had so many names. Probably because he had so many wives, but you need more. One of his names is probably Dummy and other names like that. But, you know, he really messed things up. The words of King Lemuel. But look at this. An oracle that his mother taught him. That is so important. An oracle that his mother taught him. And then the question's probably how many mothers had to say this, how many times their son, what are you doing, my son? What are you doing, son of my womb? What are you doing, son of my vows? What are you doing? Right? Do not give your strength to women. We usually think this chapter is Solomon talking about the perfect woman or finding the perfect wife, and we know he looked far and wide, but they are not actually his words when he is telling us about this perfect woman, are they? Whose words are they? Mom's. It is his mother talking to him about finding the right wife. His mother, then if it was Solomon, that means his mother was who? Bathsheba. And she is now telling him how to find the right wife. But there is something really important here that you could overlook, because her words are so powerful that he records these as an oracle. An oracle is when the word of God comes directly through a prophetic mode. Long before it was software, an oracle was how you heard from God. In the Greek world, they would go to a place when they wanted a real answer called the oracle at Delphi, and they believed at that point they could hear from all their pagan gods directly. The Bible is an oracle. Paul says that the Jews had a great advantage in the Old Testament because to them was committed the oracles of God. Think about what that is saying about this mom's advice to her son. She has given her advice to him as if it is directly from God. And he recognizes it as such. Solomon's mother gave him a prophetic word from God, which he evidently ignored and messed everything up. But he did write it down for us. Sometimes you, Mom, can be the best vehicle to speak truth, the truth of God, to your children. I remember a time I was sitting in the car with my mom. I think I was 16, and She had picked me up after school or something, or picked me up after my taekwondo lessons. I was pretty heavy into taekwondo at that time, and she starts talking to me, and she says, "So, what are you going to do with your life?" Just out of the blue, let's just discuss your life, right? And I had it all planned out, and I was excited because I thought she'd be glad to hear I have a plan. And it's like, "Mom, I have this plan. I've been working it out with Mr. Park. He was my taekwondo instructor. He owns some apartment. He owns an apartment complex in Ypsilanti, and I'm going to go live in the main apartment. I'm going to run the apartments for him while I go to Eastern and get a degree in computer sciences, and he's going to train me for the Olympics." You wouldn't know it looking at me now, but I was in training for the 1988 Olympics. I've let a few things go. And my trainer, he was the Korean national champion for 3 years, so this wasn't just talk at that time. And I was going to live there, and I had this all mapped out. "Mom, I've got it under control. It's all good." And she just paused for a second. She goes, "You know, I remember a young boy who went forward and dedicated his life to serving the Lord in ministry." It got about that quiet after she said that, too, you know. I'm so glad I had a mom that would say those things to me. So here I am. I needed to hear those words from my mother and remind me to put God back in the center of my life. Turn with me to the book of 2 Timothy, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. 2 Timothy, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. This is the passage that was in the bulletin. I switched up on them last night, so. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. I won't make you stand again, even though it is officially our scripture reading. Paul writing his last letter. It says, "Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, according to the promise of the life that is in Christ Jesus, to Timothy, my beloved child, grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and Christ Jesus our Lord. I thank God whom I serve, as did my ancestors, with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now, I am sure, dwells in you as well." You see how intimate that letter is? His very last letter, and he writes it to this young man, Timothy, who was his protege, and he's spilling out all this emotion to him, all this care for him. We already saw a lot of this when we started out in the book of Philippians, but you look at this term he uses for Timothy. What does he call him? His son, my beloved child. Not even just my son. Other times he called him my true child in the faith, but he was always referring to Timothy in these adoptive senses where he has brought Timothy in to be his only son. As far as we know, Paul never had any biological children, but he sure seems to have adopted Timothy as his own. And we see that occurring in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Keep your finger in 2 Timothy, because we will be back. But I do want to show you how this came about in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. So turn over there while you keep your finger in 2 Timothy. I want to show you how they came together. It says, "Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy." Now look at Timothy's upbringing here. The son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted him to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. They all knew Timothy. They liked Timothy, but they knew that his father was a Greek. Timothy was an exile, much like Daniel. He was part of the diaspora, all the Jews that were cast out of Jerusalem at one point, and they were living all over the world. Well, here he was living in the town of Lystra. Very much like Daniel, it was a pagan city, and in fact, as you entered the city of Lystra, the first thing you would come across was this enormous temple to the god Zeus, the chief of the Greek gods, and it was the center of worship for that city. Now, Timothy's father, being a Greek, and as often as Paul has noted it there, who do you think he probably worshipped as a god? Zeus. Exactly. When Paul and Barnabas first came to that city, they preached there 3 years later. They had a really good meeting, and the people got so excited that they thought that Paul was Mercury and that Barnabas was Zeus, because he was the bigger guy, so he must have been a little more stout than Paul. But they thought he was Zeus, and they actually came out and they were going to worship him. And Paul's like, no, you guys are missing the whole point. But they were so entrenched in this pagan worship there that that's all they could think. The gods have come here to be with us. In that environment, Timothy was living. His mother was Jewish. His mother was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was obviously not observing the faith of his Jewish wife because Timothy had never been circumcised. Yet it tells us that Timothy was a disciple in verse 1. That means he was already being trained in the faith. That means there were already people investing in his life. He was somebody, being trained by somebody in the Word of God. It also says that he was well spoken of by the brothers in the area. The church recognized him. He was a believer. He was under somebody's teaching and training. He was growing in the Lord. And it says Paul took this young man under his wing. Probably saw this young man without a father, without that kind of guidance and support, and he took him under his wing. It says he even circumcised him. That puts a big commitment on Timothy's part as to whether he wants to be with Paul. But all that tells me that Timothy's father was rather uninvolved in Timothy's Christian life experience. I'm pretty sure that I would have objected if somebody had come up and wanted to take my son as his own son and circumcise him and train him up in a new religion that I wasn't keen to and take him off to travel around the world with him. I would probably have a few things to say as the father. But we see nothing. Apparently his father was not involved. Since Timothy was already a believer, a disciple, and spoken so well of by other believers throughout the area, we have to ask the question again, how did he come to that? How did Timothy get to be that kind of a person, raised up as a believer, in good reputation with everything around them? What would you say? How do you think he got there? Mom. Exactly. In fact, now you can just flip your finger back and you're back there in 2 Timothy again. It wasn't just his mother, but it was his grandmother too. His grandmother's name was Lois. We used to have a lady named Lois up in our church in Muskegon. And this funny story, and it didn't start out funny, but it ended funny because she was spunky. And they were all out, she and these two other white-haired ladies, they're along in years, and they're out, and they went out to dinner, and they came home, and somebody had followed them back to the house. And when they stopped, he threw open the door, he put a gun in their faces, and he said, "Give me your purses." And the other two ladies gave them their purse, and this Lois, he put the gun in her face and said, "Give me your purse." And she said, "I will not." And he was flustered. He took off. He didn't know what to do. But maybe this Lois was that kind of woman, right? Because of what they were up against. But his grandmother Lois, Paul says to him, "First I saw this in your grandmother Lois, and then I saw it in your mother, and now I see it in you." So often it comes down to mothers and grandmothers who are passing along the spiritual baton to their children. Men, we got to step up to that, I'll tell you. When we lived down in Indianapolis, I was working on the rougher side of Indianapolis. I was doing like I'm doing now, where I'm working a job and pastoring a church. And my job was down in the part of Indianapolis where we had our own SWAT team available all the time. We had bullet holes in our building all the time where we worked. Right in our engineering department, we had this where it made it through the first piece of glass, and there's a piece of 9mm right between the glass panes in our office. It was that part of town. Well, I used to drive over to the library to work on my sermons and prepare for Sunday and stuff like that on my lunch. And I ended up driving past, there was a little church next door to it, Greater St. Mark's Missionary Baptist Church. It was an African-American church, and it was there serving the needs of that community, and they were providing meals for the poor in that area. God convicted my heart and said, you need to go in and ask if they need help. And I did. Now, they didn't know what to make of that at first. It's like, why are you coming in here? Why do you want to help? It's like, trust me, I just want to help. Is there anything I can help out with? I ended up serving on the food line with them. Eventually, it got to where I was giving out devotions and stuff like that to the people who came in. But that was never my intention. God said, go help, and I did. And I got 3 years with these wonderful ladies, these mothers and grandmothers who were the ones doing it all. And I saw how often in that inner city culture, it was mom and grandma who were having anything to do with bringing the kids to Christ. One lady, she was so funny. She was kind of like Lois. And one guy came in, everybody just came in the way they were. And he had his pants hanging down like this. And he came up to the line. And she couldn't have been this tall. And she leans way over that thing. She goes, young man, you're in church. Pull your pants up. And she goes, don't do it for me. Do it for Jesus. She was a wonderful lady. I don't know if she's still with us or if she's gone home to heaven, but we had some great times together. She was talking one time, and she was trying to say, but you're, and I said, it's okay, you can say it. I'm white. So we had some great times together, but I did learn there how often it was the mothers and the grandmothers who were trying to get their children off the streets and trying to get their children to have a relationship with Christ. Timothy was kind of in this same situation. Paul says, I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you. His faith was sincere. In the Greek, it's literally unhypocritical. It wasn't for show. It wasn't because he was getting the attention of all the people in the community because he was such a good boy. He had a very real faith, and it was his faith. And where Paul says, I am sure, it's not like, yeah, I'm sure it's in you. No, it goes back to that verse I had you memorize in Philippians 1 verse 6, for I am confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus. I am confident of this. And Paul is saying to Timothy, I am confident that this sincere faith is now dwelling in you. I know that your faith is real. And he says, and it lives in you. It makes its home in you. It's not something you do. It's not a behavior pattern you've learned. It is something that is inside you, and it is part of you wherever you go and whatever you do. But where did Timothy get it? From mom. It wasn't just taught, it was caught. That's what we need to see. It wasn't just taught, it was caught. The phraseology makes me think of a time when my pastor said to me one time, he pulled me aside and he said, I see this gift in you, and your mom has always had that too. Kind of passed on that way. Their faith was transferred down to Timothy, and it took. He saw how they both lived, and they lived a faithful life in a pagan land with a pagan husband, and somehow they managed to honor God in that. It makes me think of 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 2, where Peter writes, and he says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if they do not obey the word, so they're not Christians, right? Your husband is not a believer, he says, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry and the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. His mom and his grandmother somehow managed to take on that kind of conduct to where they were won without a word. They may not have won Timothy's father, but they sure did win Timothy. Moms, your demonstration of a loving and good, godly personality can rub off to your children and to your grandchildren. And in the world we live in, where so many of the generation who are now parents behind us are no longer going to church, taking the kids to church. There's been such a falling away there, and so much of that generation is not carrying it on. I have to say, grandmothers, your place is more important than ever. Maybe we need to set up a godly grannies gathering or something like that. If I call it that, Lisa probably won't take part. Not too interested in being a godly granny in those words, but maybe we need to do something like that so you can all support each other and pray for each other and for your grandkids, because grandmom, you have such a part to play now. Godliness can be passed down that way, generation to generation to generation. I do feel it's necessary to point out, too, and recognize that maybe not every woman has biological children of her own. We know that. Does not mean you don't have the heart of a mother. Does not mean you cannot be that person in a young person's life, maybe whose parents are not living out that sincere faith in front of them. But you can find the same kind of joy that Paul did in taking on Timothy as his true child in the faith. I believe that is why God gave Isaiah the message he did in Isaiah 54, 1-3. He says, "Sing, O barren one, you haven't had children, who did not bear. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, you who have not been in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married, says the Lord. Enlarge your tent, make more room, and let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes. For you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your offspring will possess the nations and the people, and will people desolate cities." Even if it's not children of your own, he says, you can just make more room, because there is such a heritage to be passed on with the heart of the mother. No one is excluded from being able to fulfill that role in life from someone who needs to know Christ, especially when we live in a world where many mothers are not doing it. Many young ladies are trying to be a mom and never had one in reality. Daniel and Timothy and Moses, with all the odds against them, everything stacked against them, the long shot like Rich Strike yesterday in the Kentucky Derby, 80-1 odds, and he won. Nobody saw it coming. It was cool. It was cool. I said, man, if you'd put $20, I'm not saying to gamble, but if you did, that'd been $1,600 payoff. Quick, simple math. But nobody would have expected this horse to come literally from nowhere. The guys are calling out, and all of a sudden, there he goes, right past him. And it's like, where'd that come from? That was Daniel. That was Timothy. That was Moses. All these guys living with all the odds stacked up against them. In a foreign land, in a world that was trying to erase anything resembling faith in God in their lives, all three were instilled with a faith that changed the world for God. And all were instilled with that through whom? Mom. That should make you feel really good, ladies. In this world we are now living in, I have to tell you this, we need you more than ever. We need you. God has a special place for you to be used. He has put a special heart in you that knows how to love and how to love fiercely. It's like 5 times in the Bible where it talks about, it compares fierce love to a mother bear robbed of her cubs. And if there's one thing, you run into a bear in the woods, that's one thing. You run into one with cubs, you go the other way. That's how fierce God's love is, and He put that in your hearts, Mom. And He wants you to reach those children, your own and others, and give them every opportunity to have a sincere faith of their own dwelling in them. For those of you who have lived this out and are living this out today, our thanks go out to you. And we honor you. We know it's not been easy. There's been more pressure on moms in the past decades than ever before. More expectations, everything. The time you give, the example you live, the way you pass the faith on means more than all the cookies and dinner and the work you do in your job and your career and all the things you do for the school, all of it put together because you can affect a young child for God. I hope you see this morning how God sees you and what you do for Him, because you're doing it for Him. My encouragement is to keep doing it, because like I said, we need you.